Well, welcome everybody to our fourth session of our whole series on innovation, entrepreneurship, and the future and how to deal with all this. So Peter and I are delighted to be here again. I want to go over the agenda and review with you what we're going to do. So let me share my screen. So the objective today is to use design thinking to create a library innovation. So the basics for design thinking, you don't want to start on a solution to anything to really understand the problem, and reframing questions are a key to understanding as we go through this exercise. And empathy is a key ingredient. Interviewing each other and sort of going deeper, asking why a lot as you talk about your issue. So there's 5 actions in design thinking. The first one is empathize, where you're going back and forth and interviewing each other about the situation. And then you're going to define the problem. Then you're going to come up with ideas. And that can be through brainstorming, anything like that. And then you actually build a prototype. What we're going to do today is just do a drawing to represent your idea. And then the testing part is something we won't be able to do today because in real life, you would be going back out to the people you're interviewing and asking them, well, you know, is this what you had in mind? But that's okay. And for those of you who like graphics, this is it in a colorful form. Again, empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test are the 5 steps. However, design thinking is not always sequential. You really don't have to follow a specific order. Sometimes you can, sometimes you'll go into some phase and then you go back and do something else, and that's fine. And they can occur in parallel. Sometimes you'll be maybe interviewing someone and maybe somebody else will be drawing, an idea, and that's fine. The whole process should be intuitive and natural. So what are the benefits? It organizes your creative development. So you've got to start somewhere with kind of step 1, step 2, step 3, and it helps build stronger teams just by the process of interviewing back and forth, and instills deeper collaboration, just going through the 5 steps, and builds confidence to launch more innovations. So you can use this, several times a year, however many you want. So this is an example that I came up with just of a library community problem. Maybe you need more engagement with local residents. And for example, for the empathize part, you would interview both librarians and residents of the community, define, kind of find out exactly what do they want, what motivates them, reframing questions on how to do that, and then come up with ideas, sift through all those, select one. You could either build a simple prototype or draw a simple solution. And then you would go back out to those you interviewed and show them what you came up with. And that's when adjustments are made, because, nothing's perfect and people will surprise you sometimes of their feedback. And so you just go back, make adjustments, and then iterate a little bit, change what you have to. Sometimes it's fine. Sometimes you can hit it for the first time. So we went over this last week, but on the negativity bias, we all know, and I have to watch it myself, we sort of naturally are going in with a negative, trying to protect what we already know, etc. So we do tend to look first for what's wrong. It's just a natural thing, but you can, as long as you're conscious of that, you can just overcome it. more or less. And I talked about point, which is just something to remind me. I use this a lot. And to use pluses, like, well, you know, when you're talking to someone, well, I like that and this. And then the opportunities, well, it might also be good to think about this. And then the issues are better phrased as questions. And we did a little bit of that in the ideation session. And then the new thinking part is just using phrases like, well, what if we did this? That sort of thing. So these are just some questions you could come up with. How might this work? What might be all the ways that we can do this? So these are just, again, some examples of questions, you know, you could pose depending on what your subject is. Again, in the library world.
This, as Michele said, is the last of all of our modules, and it's been a real privilege, and we'll say it at the end, to be working with you. As I said, I learned a lot in Michele's section. The fundamental distinction that I began the whole process with is about change and the two sources of change, inbound and outbound change. We did a little bit of inbound change, how it could go. In fact, when I talk to design people, I would actually put another question on the how can we do X better? The first question might be, how is X changing? Or how is the world changing? And then go into the outbound part. So that Michele knows that that's my kind of hobby horse with designers. We should be doing both inbound and outbound stuff. So most of this class has been about the outbound change and ideation and thinking and mindsets and things like that. And I really appreciate that. So this piece is really kind of an abbreviated piece from what we would have done, but it does, I believe, speak to the major question that should be on your minds now. Well, now what do we do? We've had this great session. We've come up with these great ideas. Not that you're going to necessarily go forward with the group that you just, you know, did your prototypes with and that, but you could, or another kind of session with your staff, with your community, with whomever. And so now we're into the creating change part. Thinking about change, planning change is one thing, but creating it is, as we know, probably 90% of the process of creating, of making change, is more than thinking, more than planning, it's actually doing. So I'm going to talk about a few of those things right now in a very abbreviated fashion. So I begin with this chart, which is a version that we had before, and that was the three types of futures. The baseline, or the expected future, is where we're headed. The alternative futures answers the question, well, what if? Challenging assumptions, looking for weak signals. And now we're going to be, and have been talking all along, about the preferable future, the visionary, the aspirational future. And that's, so just to set the context, Michele's been giving you techniques and a lot of ideas and a lot of opportunity to discuss your preferable future. Now I'm going to, kind of finish that up. So just to put that there. When I teach about the outbound change, I generally cover these four topics, and we'll cover those very briefly here today, and then we'll wind up with a little exercise. I have to tell you that there is a difference in teaching and learning this particular section compared to the inbound section. In the inbound section, you'll remember that we have a fairly common image, metaphor of the future as a road or as a river. We're trying to challenge that metaphor and say, yeah, it may be, but it's also a road that has branches, crossroads. It has a river that ends up in a river delta. So it's not just a road or a river. As opposed to the inbound metaphor that most of us carry around in our heads, and frankly, that we learned in school, the outbound does not have a clear and consistent metaphor for how to create change. In fact, if anything, it's a huge collection of different ideas and different people. I went to the Rice Library, the business library in Houston many years ago, looking for material on how to create organizational change. I came across a library shelf, floor to ceiling. Every single book in there was the same Library of Congress number, Creating Organizational Change. pulled them all down, didn't read them, obviously, but looked at the table of contents, and in a very unscientific, informal way, could come up with almost 24 different approaches to creating change. So there is no one way of doing this. In fact, I believe that your own experience of change is probably as important as any of this literature would be. And what I try to do in these 4 sections is to give you just a few ideas that there are ideas about that you might not have heard from in those literatures. So let's talk about leadership to start with. When I was first studying change in the 1960s, I did my master's thesis on students protesting the war in Vietnam. I wanted change to kind of erupt from the people, kind of a 1960s sociologist, if you will. And after a while, I realized, no, it usually does take a spark. It does take a match. It does take one or a few people to say, let's do this differently. And those are the people that I will call leaders. But we use the word leader in English in 2 different ways, one of which is more common and one of which is less. The more common use of the word leader is what I would call an authority, a person who is in charge of something, who has the rights and responsibilities to make decisions for themselves and for other people, and other people have to comply with that. So the boss, the CEO, the general in the army, the police officer on the street, the parent in the home, they are authorities. And those people in their jurisdiction are obliged to follow their orders and do what they say. Maybe what they say is not always the right thing, but you have to follow their orders anyway. Those are authorities. They can be leaders, as I'll define them, but oftentimes they are not. In fact, I would say most of them are not, because an authority does not have the mission or the desire to be a leader in that sense. So I'm going to use the word authority for people in charge of things. Another distinction we have, and this was made famous by a business professor at the University of Southern California, the difference between management and leadership. Managers, I like to say, do create change. Their change tends to be continuous, incremental, the kind of change that is improving things, more effective, more efficient systems is their objective. And they do a great job at that. Good managers, of course, they're improving, trying to make things better. They are working in the system. They're taking the goals and the structure of the system as a given. How can we make this system, this machine, this group, this organization more effective and more efficient? Compared to managers, leaders to try and transform the system. They don't work in the system, they work on the system. And that's my definition of leadership. A leader is a person who actually has the intention. And as we talked about disruptions in the inbound side, well, disruptions come in from the world like COVID, and we have to deal with it. Well, leaders are actually disruptors on purpose, with intention, to disrupt the system and to try and create something much better. And when we get to what the consequences of that are, of course, there in a second. There's another term I'd like to try and rescue, and that's the term of a visionary. It's usually, just a visionary. I mean, a dreamer, a person who just thinks of various things. And my definition of a visionary is someone who commits to accomplish something of significance. Albert Einstein was not a leader, as you will see as I define it, but he was certainly a visionary. My favorite visionary is actually a guy who used to run an elevator operator in New York City. He was featured on NPR with two little broadcasts. He's there sitting on the stool there on the left. He used to be a mechanic in the subway system, and then he hurt his back, and they gave him the job. And this is a 2-floor elevator from the street to the subway and back up again. And people would come to this elevator and they found a transformed experience, literally. He put up, as you can see, plants and pictures. You can't hear it, but he has a little boombox playing soft jazz. He had introduced himself to the people. Of course, it was much of the same people he saw every day. There was a community of about 3,000 people around that subway station who went to work every day on the subway. And they got to know each other, and the people got to know each other, and they formed a kind of a community. And I always think this is a really benchmark. I mean, if an elevator operator can transform his world, what am I doing? What have I really transformed? Have I really done something that is of significance? Now, definition of significance is each person's, what is significant to one may not be significant to the other. But I believe it's part of life to be working to achieve something of significance. Bruce Renfro, however, is not a leader because he is missing one particular element, and that element is what we typically call followers. I like the word collaborators or associates better than that. And the leader's role is to enroll people in a campaign to accomplish something of significance. So leaders are those who lead groups of people to do something over long periods of time. It's a campaign. Harvey Milk was the first actively gay supervisor in the city of San Francisco, leading the gay rights movement there in the 1980s. And in his movie, he always began each talk that he gave with this phrase, "My name is Harvey Milk, and I'm here to recruit you." He knew that that was his job. Does he have to manage? Well, if he's a good manager, that's not a bad thing, but he recruits managers. Does he have to be an authority? Does he have to be in charge of things? Well, if he's a good leader, he recruits authorities and gets people and divides up tasks. His main job is to enroll people and literally to keep them enrolled, that being what he basically does. That's my concept of leadership. I think each of us has a choice to be a leader and to enroll people, or indeed join a movement to accomplish something of significance. And that's up to each of us to talk about. The second element, the second ingredient of creating change is vision. Vision is something that's very prominent in foresight. It's not exactly goals, it's bigger than that. It's something that more or less sets, and I'll show how this works here in just a second. These are my characteristics of what a vision is. This phrase comes from George H.W. Bush, the president of the United States between Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. Bush was really a fine civil servant. He had many administrative jobs. He was Reagan's vice president. He was not particularly a visionary, however. He was more of a technocrat in a good sense. He managed the first Gulf War, and everybody gave him high praise for that. But at one time he was given a speech. He said, "What is this vision thing?" Well, if anybody was a visionary, it was Bill Clinton. He was able to hawk the vision and get people excited about the vision. So the vision is not just an idea like freedom or prosperity. It's an image. It's a picture, and you'll see some examples in a second. It should be about the future. Some people are still trying to bring back the past. I wouldn't classify those as visions. It has to be attractive and appealing, even compelling, maybe. That the people who are real leaders in our history, the leaders, I don't know that they really had a choice. Martin Luther King's father was a pastor in Atlanta, and he could have taken over that church and done a fine job for that community. I don't know that he actively considered doing that, but I don't know that he would have turned down the opportunity because he was at the right place at the right time to be a real leader, obviously the civil rights leader. Bold and ambitious. This is more than just a goal. This is more than just 5% growth that managers would set up. This is something that really transforms the world, but it can't be ridiculous. It has to be plausible, and that's a very fine line. The reaction I think that we want when we tell people our vision is, no, I don't know that we can do that. Can we really do that? You really think we can do that? It's that skepticism. Boy, that's really a big thing, but it's not ridiculous. It's not, oh, that'll never happen. Some people will say that, but it's that fine line there. The best we can be or do, the best, literally, the top of the mountain. And I think a vision should be unique. A lot of visions are boilerplate. We're the best company in the world. We're the employer of choice. I don't know anybody that's getting out of bed for that one and being motivated. But the motivation, the visions, people sign up to leaders whom they trust and believe in, and they signed up for visions that they believe are going to be something significant in the world. Here's an excellent book on creating change, or companies that have transformed themselves from good to great, Jim Collins. And his view of a vision, he doesn't call it necessarily that, are these three elements. What are you deeply passionate about? What can you do better than anybody else in the world? And what runs your economic engine? That sweet spot between those three things is one of the best criterion that I have for what makes a really good vision. Here are some examples. As you notice these, most of them are images: Land of Milk and Honey, Walking on the Moon, I Have a Dream. If you listen to Martin Luther King's speech, the 1963 I Have a Dream speech, of course, one of the great orators of history, every paragraph is an image of the change of slavery and a promissory note that's not been fulfilled, the Red Hills of Georgia, all of that. It's really a marvelous thing. So it's an image that, for the most part, motivates people to do those kinds of things. And finally, visions actually align people to work together. You can have a great organization with great people and everyone doing something good. But like a magnet, if the atoms are not aligned, you don't get macromagnetism. Every single iron atom is a little magnet, but until you run a magnet over the top and line them up, then you don't get the kind of force. So it's getting everybody moving in the same direction. Not to say that people are sitting around doing nothing, but if all the magnets are doing this and that and working on their own little things, it's not quite the same. And getting people rowing and pulling in the same direction is what this is about. It also makes supervision, management, and authority easier because we trust people. Everybody seems to be really pushing ahead. Will everybody be on the bus, to use Jim Collins? Probably not, but most of the people will be, yes. And in that sense, you have an organization that is pursuing a vision. I think another way of saying it was Michele's concepts of the why. When I look at Sinek's examples, most of those are visions. Why do we have libraries? Why do we have schools? Why do we teach the future? Because there are visionary states out there that we're moving towards. So those are two of the four elements: leadership and vision. So the third element then is, of course, planning. This is a rather cynical view at planning, that we spent all this time to announce our total failure to make any progress. So that's a rather snarky way from despair.com. But planning is an absolutely essential part of accomplishing something of significance. One of the most storied planners in history, of course, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander during the D-Day invasion in June of 1944, said plans are useless. Really? You're kidding. But planning is essential. So the plan itself doesn't really last. There's a famous phrase, it doesn't last after the first gun is fired, or as Mike Tyson said, until you get smacked in the face. After then, the plan, you can throw the plan away. Now we're into creating change. But the planning process, the discussion of what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, who's going to do what, is absolutely essential. The plans, in my estimation, come from two sources: the world, and back to our inbound and outbound change. The world gives us some idea of what it needs, what it wants, and we can't ignore that, and what it will need and want in the future, which may be different than what it was in the past and in the present. But by the same token, we're not simply directed by the world. The world is not in charge of us. We also have a seat at the table. We have values and aspirations. We want to go to work doing something that we think is important. So if both of those elements from outside the plan come from the world and come from ourselves, then we can develop a plan that is consistent and useful. The vision itself is not a goal. The vision is like a star. It is a guiding principle. It's setting a direction. It's setting a heading. But we don't get to the North Star, though we use it to navigate by. No, the mountains in this picture is the goal. We're going to get to the mountains, and we're going to go through the intervening territory, using strategies, using our talents and time to get there and move towards the goal, which is also in the direction of the vision. So all of these things kind of come together. When we're doing strategic planning, I have a little bit more elements of this, but right now that's really kind of the essence of it. Heading towards a vision, setting what the goal is, and moving out with strategies. Finally, the plans that usually are done are, I believe, usually too rigid, too big. A lot of people put down 20 goals or 25 goals. Well, in that sense, there's no priorities. It should be short, to the point, and most importantly, memorable. Because it's not like building a building, as I said before. It's more like raising a child. You have a plan, we're going to do it this way, we're going to go here, whatever, but there's an organism involved that oftentimes didn't get the memo and is not necessarily agreeable to the plan. So it's an organic process. This has now come to be called adaptive planning, which is a new way of thinking about planning as a more organic process. The more ambitious the vision and the goal, the more organic it has to be, because it's something that nobody's ever done before. We don't have a blueprint. We don't have a trail. We don't have a markers that somebody has laid out before and says, oh, then you do step 1, step 2, step 3. Most plans, unfortunately, have that element to them, but our insight and foresight is that disruptions will almost certainly occur. So thinking of adaptive planning, they call them wicked, not ordinary problems that have solutions. Foresight people will call them wicked problems that are very difficult to understand, if ever understood. They're very complicated, very complex, and probably don't have solutions. All we basically can do is manage them. We can mitigate issues, but we can't solve them. And people are always looking for that one kind of solution. So finally then, you have chosen to be a leader. You have a vision. You have a group of people who've been through the planning process. Now it's time to flip the switch, get started, and do things. And the first thing you will run into is what I talked about in change, this gap. We first have to take apart the existing system before we can implement the new system. So this was the 3 horizons concept. The first era needs to kind of go away. The first horizon kind of go away. As I said before, if you want a new kitchen, you got to bust up the old one. If you want a new accounting system, you have to stop using the old one, and you have to learn new things. You always start the learning curve at the bottom of the curve. You're not very good at it. And in that sense, people resist. Why, do we really need to leave the familiar territory? Do we really need to implement? Is that really important? And that's a great discussion to have. Because some people will believe, absolutely, yes, it's time to do this. We need to do this. It may they even think it may be existential that we do this. And others will say, no, it's not, it's going to be too hard. We're not sure what the goal is going to be. We're not sure we're going to get the result. So that's to me, the source of resistance, which is one of the major issues of creating change, the familiarity and the inertia of the existing system. But I always, I compare resistance to friction. Friction in the physical world, engineers hate friction. I mean, it creates heat and wear and tear. They have to create force to overcome inertia, to overcome friction. But without friction, we don't walk on the floor. We don't hold up a pencil. Cars don't drive on the street because it's also useful. So resistance is the thing that keeps organizations together. And so there's a function to that. There's a use to that. But at the same time, it can also inhibit the kind of changes that we think are necessary and kind of important. Creating change is mostly about people. People make it about org charts and budgets and timelines and milestones, which are all important too. But most people, if they are being asked to create change or being part of change, go through this emotional cycle, these various kinds of steps that they wish that they go through. And every one of those is very understandable. It's not something that we like to see people go through, but we accept that. So some are angry, some are disappointed, some are grieving literally over the passing of the old system, if it really is that substantial. And so we need to take that into account as we move through these phases. There's a very famous phrase that resistance is overcome only when you have a sufficient level of dissatisfaction, you have a vision, and you have some kind of plausible first steps. Then people may actually go ahead. and get on board and get started. So part of the communication here is to listen to people, as Michele did, empathize. What is the dissatisfaction here? What's the alternative to it? That's the vision. And what can we do about it to overcome resistance? If you read one book about this, I would recommend Beyond the Wall of Resistance by Rick Maurer. He actually is fairly pessimistic about the opportunity to create change. He shouldn't have started the book this way, but he did. He claims that 70% of change projects do not succeed. Mergers don't succeed. New software development doesn't succeed. The 30% that do are those that obviously follow his advice. But his approach is about people, about getting them on board, explaining the rationale, explaining the benefit, and doing that. So there's 3 times of resistance. I don't get it. We explain. I don't like it. We talk about the benefits. And I don't like you. And there's a matter of trust. There has to be a certain level of trust, and everybody flips at a different time. So turning resistance into support, making your case, removing the fear, increasing the excitement, and work on relationships. It is about a joint effort, enrolling people in a campaign to accomplish something of significance. And I think Maurer's book is a very, very good example of that. So finally, it's the people. Willingness to try something new. Can we just try? Can we try something new? Knowledge to know what that is. A lot of people who are proposing change don't take enough time explaining what it is and how it works. Motivation to do the best we can. Is this better? And the skill to be successful. So training, practicing, prototyping, experimenting, listening, all of that. If we just had those 4 things, then I think we would have more success at that. And I finally then come to the fact that we're talking about strata or levels of change. Some people will see almost any change as fundamental. Others will say, no, that's just the means. That's temporary. That can go away. What's fundamental is our values, our integrity, our professionalism, our mission, and things like that. All we're doing is creating new ways, and we hope better ways of accomplishing that, because the old ways are not suited to the time, and the old ways are something that we need to change. So with that, this is forming relationships about change and to accomplish something of significance. So those are the 4 ingredients, very briefly, that I would recommend in doing change. Leadership, leaders you can be, or you can follow leaders. Vision, the long-term real purpose. Start with why, same as Sinek's idea. Having a planning session, talking about roles and responsibilities and resources and things like that, without making it too rigid, leaving it open for change, and then finally building relationships about the change and moving forward. And just a few minutes left. The purpose of this was just to give you a taste. You're in what I'll call affinity groups, homogeneous groups with similar. And this could be a work group, enrolling yourselves as leaders, or carrying this into your staff and into your libraries and your communities. So obviously nothing accomplished, nothing finished, nothing ready to go industrial strength. But this is kind of like wine tasting. You never get enough wine to really get the buzz, but it's a taste of where it is. And I think that Michele would agree. Her sessions were the same thing. It was just an introduction to that. Something that when we do foresight projects, for instance, it can be 3 or 4 months, and I'm sure you would have the same thing. So this is just running through the steps, running through the ideas very briefly. So we appreciate that. We just have a minute or so. Michele, would you want to conclude with anything? And then I'm going to turn to Margaret and see if she wants to give us a benediction.
Yes, well, I'm just so impressed with the amount of work you did in such a short time. And I'm really energized by your energy. And I'd love to keep the dialogue going. If you want to circle back with me on anything, feel free.
Me too.
Yeah. So, and again, thanks to Jocelyn for getting us through all these 4 sessions. So again, it was just a pleasure being with you.
So Margaret, you want to finish up with the blessing, go forth and be creative?
I wanted to say thank you to everybody who managed to carve out time to spend the time with us.
Yeah.
And to let you know that Peter will be with us again in December to work on how does TAL move forward out of our 25th year into our 26th year. So I'm sure at that point he'll be checking back to see what we did. And Jocelyn's just going to let you know what's up next on this schedule.
Right, thank you, Margaret. I wanted to mention that the last set of resources that Michelle's sharing, I'll distribute those via email next week, along with an evaluation for this session. So please watch your inbox for that. And the next session will be on March 17th. Todd Hirsch from Alberta Treasury Branch will be giving a talk. And he's also the host of the Future of podcast. So I think that will be really interesting. So mark your calendars. I think the registration should be available shortly. I'm hoping next week. So we're really looking forward to it. Thanks very much, Michele and Peter. That was great.
What time, Jocelyn? Is it on 17th?
10:30 again on the 17th. Yeah. Oh, there's the dog.
There's Lucy. Margaret wanted to see Lucy. So
Michele and Peter will send you an invitation to the next session.
Oh, sure. I'd love to hear Todd's ideas. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. Thank you again. As I say, go forth and be creative.
Yeah.
And bold. And bold.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you both.